So we've all heard some absolutely insane theories about ancient Egyptians, like the fact that ancient aliens might have visited them or that aircraft actually existed in ancient Egypt, right? Well, if you like those, we're going to investigate some even more fringe theories in this video that actually have the possibility of being true. We've got things like the Great Pyramid serving as power plants, we've got things like the first Egyptians being Atlanteans from Atlantis, and we've got the fact that the Great Sphinx might be over 10,000 years old, as well as some more theories. So join me in this one as we get started right now. The first theory that we're going to talk about is that the pyramids were actually power plants rather than tombs or whatever the conventional knowledge around them is. This theory is really based around the Great Pyramid of Giza, and they say that it's not really a tomb, it's a power generator that the ancient Egyptians tapped into somehow. There are really two different versions of this theory that we're going to talk about, and the first one was pioneered by Nikola Tesla. As we all know, Nikola Tesla had some weird ideas around electricity and the earth and the energies of the earth, but he did figure out how to generate electricity with his Tesla coils, all that kind of stuff, which is why he was asked, but that's besides the point. Anyway, he saw the earth as two poles, north and south, that created endless amounts of energy, released them into the ionosphere, which is the electrically charged portion of the atmosphere, and he wished for us to be able to tap into that. What he really wanted to do was use this ionosphere to transport electricity around the globe without the use of wires, which wires and electricity, that's a whole industry, which is, again, part of why he was iced, but we're not going to talk about that. He believed that the ancient Egyptians had ideas of how to actually do this, and that this pyramid was part of this system that allowed them to do this generation of electricity. He based a lot of his work, including his Tesla generators themselves, on the pyramids and the Great Pyramid in specific. Like, there's mathematical principles that went into it that perfectly align the Great Pyramid with the Tesla coils. Tesla even built mega Tesla towers on like the East Coast, and there's one more, I think it's in Colorado Springs, it says right here. Yeah, Colorado Springs, the Tesla experimental station. He based these locations based on mathematical principles of where the Great Pyramid of Giza was located, and he believed that the numbers 3, 6, and 9 were some kind of key to the universe, which that's a little bit wacky, but anyway, he based a lot of this stuff on the Egyptians. He literally thought the Great Pyramid could transmit electricity through the ionosphere. It's really weird stuff, but there's another facet of this theory made by a man named Christopher Dunn. This man, Christopher Dunn, was a machinist that was at the top of his game. Like, he worked for some big companies. He was really good. He honed his craft. He's an expert in the field. Well, what he did was he decided to get obsessed with the technologies of ancient Egypt. And whenever he started doing that, he started looking at the pyramids and started thinking, these things could be generators. Tesla could have been onto something, but his version's a little bit different. He believes that rather than the Tesla idea of it being an electrical generator that used the ionosphere, stuff like that, that this thing was an electron harvester. Basically, he thinks that every structure in the Great Pyramid is created for a specific reason. There's a king's chamber, a queen's chamber, there's other stuff. There's even rods and shafts going through the walls of this thing. It's really crazy. A general rundown of this theory is right here on screen. I'm actually reading through it myself. It says that according to Dunn, the Great Pyramid of Giza was actually a machine that used hydrogen to produce electricity. He argues that the pyramid's internal chambers and passages were designed to produce a chemical reaction that generated hydrogen gas, which was then used to power an electrical generator. An interesting point to add to this is that the shafts that are in these chambers perfectly line up with the thickness of the wavelength of hydrogen atoms. So these electrons will be harvested, shot through these shafts, and then it would go on to fire an electrical generator somehow. That's basically what I'm thinking. I don't really know how this would work, but it sounds pretty cool. Here's something else that's interesting. A lot of people that have read this theory and thought about it, whatever, they think that ancient Egyptians had no proof that they could actually generate hydrogen gas, which this whole theory is based on. But as this says right here, recent studies have shown that ancient Egyptian artisans were capable of creating hydrogen gas using a simple chemical reaction using iron and vinegar. So hydrogen gas creates electricity in this pyramid. It powers a generator, and ancient Egyptians had electricity. Now that's another theory that I'm going to talk about. It's kind of tied into this one, but part two, there's some evidence, circumstantial at best, but it says that these ancient Egyptians might have actually had electricity. Alright, so there's some carvings and hieroglyphics found in a temple in Egypt that show basically what looks like electricity. It's probably not, but it looks like a light shining on something else. I'll throw a picture on screen and I'll kind of describe it for you. It looks like there's a pharaoh or an Egyptian man holding a lotus flower, but it looks like a lamp. It looks like a lamp shining a light beam on something else, somebody praying, something like that. But really what it is, it's a lotus flower with a snake coming out of it, and it's just kind of sculpted around that. but kind of looks like they had light. This theory is probably not true. So how do we really feel about the power plant theory? I'm gonna be honest, it seems like it's kind of a shot in the dark, but it'd be really cool if it was true. The thing is, a lot of researchers and mathematicians have actually like done the math, done the research. It was possible. Like they could have done this and we really just wouldn't have known because, you know, stuff gets lost in transition. The Library of Alexandria lost a bunch of stuff, knowledge that could have been in there regarding electricity, but we would have had it somewhere else. That's the thing. If this thing was common in ancient Egypt, it would have spread. So what am I really going to say about this theory? I'm going to say that this theory is probably not true, but it would be awesome if it was. Just real quick, thank you a ton for watching. You have absolutely no idea how much it means to me. If you're enjoying this video, hit that like and subscribe button. We're on a steady content grind now. I'm loving this stuff. I hope you're loving it too. Now, let's get back into the video. So those theories were kind of about the pyramids themselves being electrical generators, but this next theory is going to go a little bit off the deep end from that. This theory says that the pyramids are all connected in a global energy network. This theory is based on the French theory of ley lines, which are basically imaginary lines that you can draw on a map that connect centers of power, things like the pyramids, Stonehenge, monuments that are important to the world. They draw imaginary lines from them and say that maybe there's like a source of power along these lines. You got things like the pyramids in Egypt, the big structures in Teotihuacan, you've got the Nazca lines, Machu Picchu. There's literally endless amounts of things on these imaginary ley lines because they literally just make up lines, draw them on a map, say that the Earth's power is channeled there, anywhere along those lines. Now, what I read about this theory didn't go this far, but basically what this thing means is that anything along these lines has great power and you can kind of harness it kind of in the way that the electron harvester theory says, whatever, transport power across the world. It's kind of just cuckoo. This is not real. This next theory itself is one of my favorite, but only because it sets up the next one, which is my favorite theory on this entire list. This theory says the Sphinx is over 10,000 years old. All right, so traditional wisdom says that the Great Sphinx of Giza is around 4,500 or so years old. We all know that the Sphinx was the head of a human and the body of a lion. It was a massive carving that's in Egypt. It was created during the Old Kingdom, supposedly. So where does this theory get the idea that the Sphinx is actually way older than that? Well, there's two key dudes to this theory, John Anthony West and Robert Schoch. So John Anthony West was not a scientist at all. He was an author and he wrote science fiction, so keep that in mind whenever you think about the fact that he created this theory. It's a theory, it's probably fiction, but anyway, he came up with this idea. He wrote about it in his book. He wrote that the water erosion evidence on the Sphinx's surface actually dates it back to 10,000 years ago or 10,000 BC. He's had alternate versions of this theory come out. So who is that Robert Schoch dude I talked about? Well, he's a geologist, and John Anthony West teamed up with him to try to, validate his claims that the Sphinx was this old. West's theory wasn't completely validated by Schoch's dating, but he does agree with the fact that the Great Pyramids show erosion by wind and sand, whereas the Great Sphinx shows erosion and lots of erosion by water, which would place it back to like the flood or floods of the Nile, something like that, 10,000 years ago. Now, you'll never guess what West said caused this water erosion and these floods that caused this water erosion on the Sphinx. Atlantis. That's right, this guy ties the stories of Atlantis back to all of these crazy theories about the Sphinx. Now, to understand where the basis of this Atlantis theory comes from, you got to look at this guy named Edgar Cayce, who was a clairvoyant. This guy was absolutely wild. He thought that he could diagnose diseases and treat stuff while people were asleep. Really weird clairvoyant type stuff. He talked about the afterlife. He talked about reincarnation, spirit stuff, what's happening in the next life. It's all really, really crazy stuff. But he also talks about Atlantis. Man, see, once upon a time I was an Atlantean and then I died and came back as an Egyptian and now I'm here in America. Anyway, this guy claimed that there was a hall of records under the Great Sphinx that contained a ton of records from the ancient world, including evidence that Atlantis was real. Not just that Atlantis was real though, that Atlanteans left Atlantis whenever it sunk in the ocean because of the earthquakes or whatever sunk it, and they came to Egypt and founded Egypt. From there, they created the Great Sphinx. This stuff is pretty crazy, but here's the thing, it could possibly be true. There's a guy named Zahi Hawass who is an Egyptian Egyptologist who was in charge of like the ministry of everything to do with everything ancient Egypt related over in Egypt. Well, the thing about this guy is he's a gatekeeper of all these secrets, all this stuff. He won't allow for new discovery, new exploration, anything like that, and he never has. He's like the arch enemy of this guy named Graham Hancock, who's another alternative historian who researched and theorized a lot about ancient Egypt and ancient civilizations, stuff like that. He's a little bit crazy too, but just know that everybody involved in this, every archaeologist in ancient civilization research, is just a little bit kooky. So why did I bring him up? There's these holes that are in the Sphinx, like in the head of the Sphinx, that he just has them fill up. Like he has his workers fill them up. He says nobody can look in there. Nobody can ever look under the Sphinx. There may be a hall of records under there, and we just don't know. Like this theory blows my mind because we cannot look at it. We can't figure anything about it out because of people like Zahi. And that's why it just gets on my nerves. But anyway, everything that we've been saying about the Hall of Records and Atlantis leads us to our next theory, and that is what I already mentioned, that the ancient Egyptians were at first Atlanteans. So what exactly do we know about the Atlanteans? Well, we know from Plato's account that there was once a civilization that existed out in the ocean past the Straits of Gibraltar, or the Pillars of Hercules as he called them, that one day just sunk into the ocean forever and nobody's ever seen it again. This theory starts here. It says that these ancient Atlanteans escaped Atlantis, or at least part of them did. They escaped via boat. They got to Egypt and they started Egypt. Like they were the founders of ancient Egypt. Not just Egypt though. This says that some of them escaped to places like the Americas, where they created civilizations like the Aztecs and Olmecs, the very old stuff. Not the Aztecs, probably like the Maya, something like that. But anyway, the really, really old civilizations, they might have had a hand in it. Now, the only evidence for this is circumstantial at best. It's that there's like pyramids, literally different areas. Egypt, there's some in the Americas, like in Mexico. It's really just circumstantial evidence. There's really no truth or proof or anything like that behind this theory, but it's pretty cool. Now, there is one more thing about this theory that I'd like to mention, and it's that Plato's account apparently came to him from his grandfather, who got this from a guy named Solon. Solon got all this information about Atlantis from this Egyptian priest who said that once upon a time there was a civilization named Atlantis, but this was over 9,000 years ago. Like 9,000 years from the time this priest told Solon. Plato lived in like the 3rd and 4th century BC, so we're already talking about over 2,000 years ago, and then 9,000 years back behind that. That's like, what, 11,000 and some change years ago? So this theory says that the Atlanteans started ancient Egypt over like 11,000 years ago. This earlier theory says that the Sphinx dates back to over 10,000 years ago. There's a hall of records that nobody will let us explore. It all ties together. I mean, it's pretty convincing to me. Not really. I really don't think any of this is true because Atlantis is just probably too good to be true, but I wish it was. It is a little bit weird though that all this stuff dates back to the same times and all these theories mesh together perfectly, and the Egyptians won't let us look at anything. But anyway, let's talk about our last theory. This theory says that the biblical Moses was actually the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten, or another Egyptian pharaoh, or at least something to do with Akhenaten. If you know anything about Akhenaten, he was an Egyptian pharaoh that served from like 1300 roughly somewhere in there BC to also 1300 somewhere in there BC, like 20 or 30 years, something like that. Anyway, he tried to convert all the Egyptians into monotheism under the god Aten. This theory basically says that this guy Akhenaten was the biblical Moses, but it was just the Israelite interpretation of Moses. Alright, so right around the time of the book of Exodus taking place, which was basically when Moses led the Israelite people out of Egypt, that same time period is estimated to be when Akhenaten was completely erased from Egyptian lore. Like, there was a certain time period whenever all mentions of him just ceased. Like, it was like he never existed. It's kind of thought that this guy might have been Moses, and he was leading the Israelite people out of there. I don't know how this would get so crosswired in history. I don't know how this is really even a theory, because there's just no way to me. But there is the circumstantial evidence that Moses was part of a pharaoh family, or he was hunted down because of who he was, stuff like that. He does have ties to Egypt, so maybe, just maybe, this was true. There are literally countless theories about Moses out there, so literally there could be a dedicated video to the study of who Moses was, because literally you can go so many different directions with it. But anyway, he could have been Akhenaten. Akhenaten was monotheistic. He studied one god. The Israelites had their own writing systems and could have written about him and transformed this Aten god into Yahweh, or the biblical God as we know him today. Stuff like that. You know, it could have happened. I'm not putting it past anything in history. Oh yeah, do you know who actually came up with this theory, or at least the basis of this theory? Sigmund Freud. He believes that rather than having Israelite origins, Moses was actually an Egyptian. Like, he was the prophet of Akhenaten for the god Aten. That's really where this all stems from. He looks at history, he says, maybe that was the case. That's where we got it. All right, that's all the Egyptian theories that I have time for in this one. If you like this video, you're gonna love the Ancient Mysteries of the World iceberg video, because it's gonna tell you theories and speculation about literally all the ancient mysteries of the world, not just Egypt. Watch that video right here. It's linked on screen. And until next time, I'm going to be going to ancient Egypt and investigating the Sphinx. I'm actually going to look and see where Zahi's Hall of Records is that he is hiding. So, yeah, until next time, peace.